The war is in full swing, but something unthinkable happens on the battlefield. A small biplane, a model considered obsolete and insignificant, begins to cause panic in one of the largest armies in the world. The Po-2, a low-powered Soviet aircraft, was defying the expectations of Luftwaffe generals in ways they never imagined possible. While the Luftwaffe used high-performance fighters and sophisticated war machines, this small plane was about to accomplish the impossible. More than 160 sorties in a single night. How could an antiquated, weak aircraft without the necessary speed or firepower be causing so much chaos in enemy lines? How could something so primitive be making the most advanced air force in the world look helpless? On a moonless night in late 1943, the Wehrmacht headquarters near Stalingrad was gripped by a strange sense of unease. It was something they couldn't understand, something that made even the most experienced officers feel vulnerable. For weeks, their most seasoned Luftwaffe pilots had patrolled the skies, attacking with full force, dominating the air with the confidence that came from superior technology and training. But unexpectedly, an invisible force began making its incursions. They soon realized that a Soviet aircraft, a simple Po-2 biplane, was accomplishing something unimaginable: 160 sorties in a single night. And in all those missions, the biplane wreaked havoc on German forces, silently and lethally, appearing and disappearing like a ghost that haunted their dreams and shattered their sense of security. The German soldiers had stopped sleeping. In their bunkers and trenches, they lay awake, listening to the darkness, straining to hear the sound that had become the soundtrack of their nightmares. A soft whooshing, like wind through dead branches, like the sweep of a broom across a wooden floor. When they heard it, they knew the bombs would follow. There was no warning siren, no roar of engines, nothing that their sophisticated defense systems could detect until it was too late. Just that whisper in the night, and then fire raining from the sky. One captured German soldier, interrogated by Soviet intelligence officers, said it simply: "We could not sleep. The women kept us awake, night after night, sometimes 8 times, 12 times, 18 times, in a single darkness. We hated them, and we feared them more than we feared your tanks, your artillery, your infantry assaults, because we could see those things coming. We could prepare. But these women, these ghosts in their wooden planes, they gave us no warning. They gave us no rest. They gave us only terror. They called these invisible killers Nachthexen, night witches. The name was meant as an insult, a dismissive joke about women who dared to fight like men. It became a legend that would outlive the war itself. It became a name that German soldiers would whisper in the dark, a name that carried more fear than any mechanized division or artillery: bombardment. Because the night witches had discovered something that the generals, with all their advanced technology, had missed: that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the one that makes the loudest noise, but the one that makes no sound at all. The Po-2 was initially developed in the 1920s by Nikolai Polikarpov, a brilliant Soviet aircraft designer who would later be called the king of fighters. But the Po-2 was not a fighter. It was designed as a primary trainer, a simple biplane that student pilots could learn on without destroying expensive equipment. For many years it was used for simple training and reconnaissance tasks, for crop dusting, for postal deliveries, for anything that required a cheap, reliable aircraft that could take off and land in small spaces. It didn't possess the speed, firepower, or sophistication of the modern aircraft of the era. Its maximum speed was barely 150 kilometers per hour, slower than many automobiles. Its wooden frame covered with canvas fabric seemed laughable compared to the sleek metal fighters that dominated the skies. It was a relic, something that belonged in aviation museums rather than battlefields. However, When war broke out on June 22nd, 1941, when 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border in the largest military invasion in human history, when the Luftwaffe destroyed over 1,000 Soviet aircraft in the first day alone, the Soviet Union found itself fighting for survival with whatever weapons it could scrape together. They didn't have the luxury of choice. They didn't have time to develop new aircraft or wait for better equipment. They had to adapt what was available, and they had to do it immediately or face annihilation. The Po-2 was converted into a true war machine, a silent night killer that would challenge the Luftwaffe's elite combat forces in ways no one could have predicted. Soviet engineers stripped away everything unnecessary. They added bomb racks that could carry 2 small bombs, one under each lower wing. They modified the cockpits to accommodate a pilot in front and a navigator bombardier in the rear. They kept the aircraft as light as possible, refusing to add radio equipment, radar, defensive weapons, or even parachutes, because every kilogram of extra weight would slow the already sluggish aircraft even further. The result was an aircraft that looked more like a death trap than a weapon of war. And in the hands of the right pilots, it became both. While German forces prepared their most complex strategies, investing in advanced radar systems, powerful searchlights capable of illuminating aircraft from kilometers away, and coordinated defense networks that had proven devastatingly effective against British and American bombers, the Po-2 emerged with a completely new combat style: psychological warfare. Its nighttime sorties, quick and precise, were enough to terrorize enemy lines, and the Wehrmacht didn't know how to react to this threat. How could something so simple be so effective? How could an aircraft with such inferior technology defeat the world's best fighters? How could wooden planes flown by women who weren't even professional soldiers before the war cause more psychological damage than squadrons of heavy bombers? The answer lay not in technology, but in tactics, in the understanding that war isn't always won by the biggest guns, but sometimes by the most unexpected approaches. The Night Witches had discovered something that would become a fundamental principle of asymmetric warfare: that weakness can be transformed into strength if you understand how to use it. Their slow speed, which seemed like a fatal flaw, actually made them nearly impossible for German fighters to intercept. Their wooden construction, which seemed primitive and vulnerable, actually made them invisible to radar. Their lack of defensive armament, which seemed suicidal, actually made them lighter and more maneuverable than any combat aircraft in the sky. The Luftwaffe, with its air superiority and highly sophisticated machinery, was accustomed to dominating the skies. Their Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters were fast, powerful, deadly, capable of speeds exceeding 600 kilometers per hour. Their Focke-Wulf FW-190s were even more impressive, combining speed with devastating firepower. Their pilots were trained to engage in high-speed dogfights, to outmaneuver and outgun any opponent, to kill with precision and efficiency. They had conquered the skies over Poland in weeks, defeated the French Air Force in a matter of days, driven the Royal Air Force from the continent. They were the undisputed masters of aerial combat. But the Po-2 didn't follow the rules of modern warfare. With a weak engine that could barely exceed 150 kilometers per hour, with a cruising speed often below 120 kilometers per hour, the Po-2 seemed more like a relic from the First World War than a weapon that could threaten the Third Reich. Its structure of wood and cloth, instead of metal and aluminum, made it a visibly inferior aircraft. The plane was so basic that it didn't even have an electrical system. The pilot and navigator communicated by speaking tube and hand signals. Navigation was accomplished with a map, a compass, and a stopwatch. Bomb release was calculated by the navigator literally leaning out of the cockpit and visually tracking the target as they approached. But the Soviets saw its potential as a nighttime assault aircraft, recognizing that sometimes the greatest strength lies in being underestimated. They understood that the Germans had built their entire air defense strategy around fast, high-altitude bombers. The Luftwaffe night fighters were designed to intercept aircraft flying at 300 kilometers per hour or faster. Their tactics, their weapons, their entire approach was optimized for that kind of combat. The Po-2 flew at less than half that speed. When German fighters tried to slow down enough to engage, they would stall and a fall from the sky. The Night Witches had found a speed gap, a vulnerability in the German system that no amount of technological sophistication could overcome. The Soviet tactic was simple, but surprisingly effective. Soviet pilots, trained for night flights and covert operations, used darkness to their advantage in ways the Germans never anticipated. The Po-2 didn't have radar or the technological capabilities of modern fighters, but it possessed an ability that no fighter had: the capacity to fly low, practically skimming the treetops, invisible to ground observers and radar systems that were designed to detect aircraft at medium and high altitudes. The aircraft used the cover of night to infiltrate German defense lines, attacking military targets and leaving Wehrmacht headquarters stunned, unable to understand what was happening. The Germans had built their entire defensive strategy around detecting and intercepting fast, high-flying bombers. They had invested enormous resources in radar stations, searchlight batteries, anti-aircraft guns, and night fighter squadrons. They had created interlocking defensive zones where nothing should have been able to penetrate without being detected, illuminated, and destroyed. They never imagined that the real threat would come low and slow, creeping beneath their sophisticated detection systems like a predator stalking prey in the darkness. They never imagined that their most effective enemy would be a wooden biplane that cost less than a single cannon shell from their largest artillery pieces. The Po-2 carried out quick and precise attacks, almost like an eagle hunting in silence. But these were not random attacks. Every mission was carefully planned, every target chosen for maximum strategic and psychological impact. The pilot teams were composed of women, often young, many still teenagers, known as the Night Witches. They were members of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, later designated the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment in recognition of their extraordinary service. They were trained to fly in extreme conditions that would have grounded conventional aircraft, often without being seen by the enemy until the last moment, until the bombs were already falling and it was too late to react. These women weren't professional soldiers before the war. They were students studying literature and mathematics, teachers who had been preparing the next generation, factory workers who had been building tractors and automobiles, farm girls who had learned to fly in local aviation clubs because they dreamed of touching the sky. They were ordinary Soviet citizens who volunteered to defend their homeland when the Nazi invasion threatened to destroy everything they loved. When Marina Raskova, the famous Soviet aviator, convinced Stalin to authorize the formation of all-female aviation regiments, 2,000 women applied. Only 400 were selected. They were given a few months of intensive training and then sent to the front lines to face the most powerful military machine the world had ever seen. They attacked mainly supply depots, communication lines, ammunition dumps, fuel storage facilities, railway junctions, and even unsuspecting troop units resting in what they thought were secure rear areas. Their targets were chosen strategically to maximize disruption and psychological impact, to create the impression that nowhere was safe, that the darkness itself had become the enemy. On a typical night, a single Po-2 crew would fly 8 to 12 sorties, returning to base to rearm and refuel between each mission. Some nights they flew 15 or 18 sorties. The record, achieved by pilot Nadezhda Popova and navigator Yekaterina Ryabova, was 18 sorties in a single night, each one a separate journey into enemy territory, each one a separate dance with death. The Po-2 could drop bombs almost invisibly, with a level of precision that surprised the Germans and terrified them in equal measure. The technique they developed became their signature, the thing that made them truly legendary. 3 aircraft would approach the target together in loose formation. 2 would deliberately expose themselves, turning on their engines to full power, drawing searchlights and anti-aircraft fire. While the Germans focused on these decoys, the 3rd aircraft would cut its engine completely and glide silently toward the target. The only sound was the whisper of wind through the canvas-covered wings and wooden struts. German soldiers said it sounded like a witch's broomstick sweeping through the sky, and the name stuck. The Wehrmacht, accustomed to the thunder and impact of conventional bombers, the roar of engines that gave minutes of warning, was now being attacked by something they had no idea how to combat. An antiquated biplane was becoming an aerial nightmare, operating under the rules of a completely different kind of war. The psychological impact was immense and devastating. German soldiers began to dread the night, lying awake in their trenches, listening for the soft whisper of canvas wings that signaled death from above. The sound became so distinctive, so terrifying, that soldiers claimed they could distinguish individual aircraft by the pitch of the wind through their struts. Sleep deprivation became a serious problem in units stationed near Night Witch operating areas. Combat effectiveness declined. Morale crumbled. Discipline problems increased. Luftwaffe generals, with all their experience and advanced technology, began to question the effectiveness of their strategies and their own competence. How could a simple biplane, with low speed and minimal weapons, cause so much damage? How could it perform so many sorties in a single night without being detected or intercepted? How could women, who Hitler had declared incapable of military service, be defeating their elite pilots? These were men who had planned the conquest of Europe, who had defeated the French Air Force in weeks, who had dominated the skies over Poland and the Low Countries with what seemed like effortless superiority. And now they were being humiliated by wooden planes flown by women they had dismissed as incapable of combat, women they had assumed would collapse under the stress of war. The Po-2 was giving the Wehrmacht a type of invisible war, where attacks weren't detected until impact was made, where the enemy seemed to materialize from the darkness itself. The Soviet tactic was revolutionary because it made use of the surprise factor in an unusual and unpredictable way. Instead of engaging in long and risky air battles that would have been suicide for the slow biplanes, Po-2 pilots focused on quick missions, disorienting, and creating panic in German lines. They would turn off their engines and glide silently over their targets, release their bombs with timing calculated by the navigator counting seconds, restart their engines, and disappear into the darkness before the Germans could mount an effective response. This engine-cutting tactic became their signature move, the thing that made them truly invisible to both radar and human observers, the thing that transformed them from pilots into ghosts. Frustration at Wehrmacht headquarters intensified each night as the attacks continued, without any effective countermeasure. Although Luftwaffe forces sent interception fighters, the fastest and most advanced aircraft in their inventory, the Po-2 moved so silently and unexpectedly that it was rarely detected in time to intercept. The speed was low, but the tactic of using darkness to their advantage made it almost invisible to radars and observers' eyes. German fighter pilots found themselves in an impossible situation that violated everything they had been trained to do. Their fast, powerful aircraft couldn't slow down enough to engage the Po-2 without stalling and falling from the sky. Their minimum speed was higher than the Po-2's maximum speed. When they did manage to get close, when they thought they had finally caught one of these elusive targets, the wooden biplane would simply turn off its engine and disappear into the night, gliding silently to a new position, while the frustrated fighter pilot searched empty sky, burning precious fuel, knowing that his sophisticated aircraft had been outwitted by something that looked like it belonged in a museum. The Germans tried everything they could think of. They increased searchlight coverage, positioning batteries every few kilometers along the front lines. They deployed more anti-aircraft guns, creating defensive zones so dense that they calculated nothing could fly through them and survive. They assigned their best night fighter pilots to hunt the night witches, offering iron crosses and other decorations to anyone who could shoot one down. They even tried using older, slower aircraft like the Arado R-66 and Gotha Go 145 biplanes, thinking that perhaps fighting wood with wood was the answer. Nothing worked consistently. The Po-2 was too small, too slow, too unexpected, too different from anything the German military machine had been designed to counter. Over time, the Po-2 continued to be a constant headache for the Luftwaffe, a thorn in the side of the Wehrmacht that they could never quite extract. Wehrmacht generals began to change their strategies, redeploying resources, adjusting defensive positions, but they were still completely perplexed by the effectiveness of this antiquated biplane. They wrote reports to Berlin describing the problem, but the reports sounded absurd even to them. How could they explain to the high command that they were being defeated by wooden planes flown by women? How could they request additional resources to combat an enemy that seemed more psychological than physical? They tried everything. More searchlights that only created more shadows for the Po-2 to hide in. More anti-aircraft guns that the night witches learned to navigate around. Night fighter patrols that exhausted pilots and burned fuel while achieving minimal results, even offering medals and promotions to any pilot who could shoot down a night witch. But nothing worked consistently enough to stop the attacks or restore the sleep and sanity of German soldiers. The Po-2 wasn't just a weapon of war. It was a lesson that even in modern warfare, tactics can be more powerful than technology, that adaptation can defeat sophistication, that courage can overcome firepower. It proved that innovation doesn't always mean building something bigger, faster, or more destructive. Sometimes innovation means using what you have in ways your enemy never expects, seeing possibilities where others see only limitations. The night witches flew outdated biplanes made of wood and canvas, aircraft that any military analyst would have declared obsolete and useless for combat operations, but they flew them with courage, skill, and tactical brilliance that made them more effective than squadrons of modern bombers. They flew them with a determination born from seeing their homes destroyed, their families killed, their country invaded by an enemy who viewed them as subhuman and disposable. Today, the Po-2 is remembered as one of the greatest examples of how a well-executed strategy can overcome superior military machinery, how asymmetric warfare can neutralize technological advantages, how the human spirit can find ways to fight even when all conventional wisdom says defeat is inevitable. Modern warfare was changing, and the Po-2 proved that when used with intelligence and boldness, even the simplest aircraft can become a tool of great impact. The Po-2 wasn't just an aircraft. It was a symbol of Soviet resistance, the courage of female aviators who proved that women could fight as effectively as men, and strategic adaptation in the face of overwhelming odds. It represented the idea that victory doesn't always go to the side with the best equipment, but to the side that uses their equipment most creatively, most courageously, most intelligently. The night witches flew more than 30,000 sorties during the war. They dropped more than 23,000 tons of bombs on German positions. They destroyed or damaged 17 bridges, 9 railways, 2 railway stations, 26 warehouses, 12 fuel depots, 176 armored cars, 86 firing points, and approximately 11 searchlights. They flew in canvas-covered biplanes that could be torn apart by a single bullet, in aircraft that had no radios, no parachutes, no defensive weapons. 32 of them died in combat. 23 were awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal, the highest honor their country could bestow. Every single one of them was a volunteer. Every single one of them chose to face death, night after night, because they believed their country was worth dying for. Wehrmacht headquarters never knew exactly how to react to this invisible threat that seemed to violate every principle of modern warfare. The Po-2, in its simplicity and effectiveness, challenged preconceived ideas about war and military aviation, about what weapons were effective and what tactics were viable, about who could fight and who should be protected. And while the Luftwaffe struggled to combat this unforeseen threat, burning resources and manpower in a futile attempt to stop the attacks, Soviet female aviators continued to launch their sorties, writing a story of courage and innovation in the skies of World War II. They flew night after night, mission after mission, knowing that each flight could be their last, but refusing to stop because their country needed them, and they had proved that women could fight just as effectively as men. That courage and skill mattered more than gender. That determination could overcome any obstacle. If this story about the Po-2 biplane and Soviet resistance surprised and inspired you, don't forget to like and share with your friends who need to hear about real courage, real innovation, real heroism. Subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories of war, strategy, and the courage of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things when history demanded it. And remember, in war, adaptation and innovation can be the key to victory, even against the greatest adversaries, even when all conventional wisdom says you cannot possibly win. The Night Witches proved that underestimation is a weapon that cuts both ways, that sometimes being dismissed as insignificant is the greatest advantage you can have, that your enemy's arrogance can become your greatest ally. They proved that wooden planes and iron courage can defeat metal fighters and technological superiority. They proved that women are just as capable of heroism as men, just as capable of sacrifice, just as capable of changing the course of history. Thank you for watching, and until next time, with more stories of heroes who defied the odds and changed history through courage, ingenuity, and the refusal to accept that something is impossible simply because someone says it is. Stories of people who looked at impossible situations and found ways to win anyway. Stories that remind us that the human spirit is the most powerful weapon ever created.